Welcome to Berkeley. Those of you who got here yesterday got the full-on Berkeley experience, I'm glad to say. My name's Ethan Shagan. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of the Center for British Studies here at Berkeley. It's actually sort of embarrassing that I'm doing this and introducing you because it's James, who is the former director of the Center for British Studies, who actually made this conference happen. But nonetheless, here I am. Thank you for coming. I think it's going to be a really fun weekend talking about issues of mutual concern across the late modern, early modern divide. I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the logistics of the weekend, because obviously this is a very strange conference. And then I'm going to let James talk for a couple of minutes about the intellectual side of what he thinks that we're doing here, and to provide something like some issues, if not exactly an agenda for the weekend. And then we can get started with the first panel. So this is the first conference in what will be a 3-year cycle of conferences funded by a generous grant from the Mellon Foundation. And so my first happy task is to thank the folks at Mellon for all of our money, especially Joe Meisel, and especially Candace Grosskreutz in the back of the room, who is the one who actually made all of this happen. Our grant is shared between the participating consortium universities, Yale, Berkeley, Chicago, and Texas, and it's intended to promote discussions of Britain's transition to modernity. The issues that James and Steve decided would most appropriately reach that overarching issue are this conference on the state in British history, and then a conference next year on civil society, and a conference the following year on empire. One of those conferences will be at New Haven, the other will be at London, and we don't know yet which will be which. We'll figure that out hopefully this weekend. In addition, there are a series of smaller regional conferences that bring in students and faculty from across the areas where the four main universities are. And our grant from Mellon covers not only these events, but also pays for graduate students from all the universities to fly to all of them, and also pays for participating graduate students, in some circumstances, to fly to the NACBS for more acculturation into the field. So part of the point of this grant is to promote camaraderie amongst the graduate students, to let you all know who you are, to get to imagine yourselves as a cohort, to get to know the people you're going to be stuck with for the next 50 years of your lives. You don't know yet what I mean, but you will. So this conference today is built around 4 main roundtable sessions and 2 smaller breakout sessions intended for graduate students. Let me briefly talk about the breakout sessions. There was a sheet that was out on the table out there which described who all was going to be at which breakout session in terms of which graduate students' prospectuses and job letters and so forth were discussed where. So if you don't know where you're supposed to be, that should tell you. If you're not on there, faculty, if you want to come be helpful to the graduate students, that's great. Graduate students, I urge you, please, to go to those sessions, even if your work is not being discussed. This is an opportunity for you, no matter what level you're at, even if you're just starting graduate school, to see how these things work, to understand what a dissertation prospectus looks like, what a job letter looks like, the sorts of critiques that might be available. Again, a big part of this grant and of this conference is intended not just for intellectual matters, but to provide this sort of robust professional help for students. So please avail yourself of that. Then the main conference will consist of these 4 roundtable sessions, metaphorical roundtable sessions around our rectangular table. Today we'll do Where is the State and Religion in the State. Tomorrow we'll do Violence in the State and When was the State. This obviously is an experimental format for a conference. Roundtables like this have proliferated at conferences in the United States in recent years, but I've never heard of a conference that's based entirely upon them. Our rationale was that since everyone knows that the most stimulating and important parts of conferences are not the boring sessions, but the conversations at the bar, we would simply forego the papers and institutionalize the conversations at the bar. Steve?
The bar seems to, alcohol seems to be...
There is a bar, and that was the very next thing I was going to say. Is that There's lots of downtime built into this conference. You will see on your schedule. That is because we want the conversations to continue, for you all to get to know one another and to talk about the issues we're talking about. There is a bar just around the corner and to the right, where hopefully many of us will decide to spend some part of the day. Each roundtable will last approximately 2 hours. I'm going to moderate all of them insofar as my voice remains, in order to provide some coherence to the weekend. And to begin each session, I will introduce the panelists, and then each of the panelists will be invited to speak for a few minutes about whatever, to respond to the issue of the panel, however they wish. And then I'm going to follow up with questions and keep the ball rolling. At some point early in each session, I'm going to open up the floor to the audience. The point is to encourage a large-scale discussion of these issues, not just a small-scale one amongst the panelists. And we're counting on vigorous participation from all of you to make this conference work. That doesn't mean we want you to yell out, "You lie," or the equivalent. Civility is always welcome. But of course, many of you have expertise on these issues that's different from and complementary to the expertise of the panelists. Many of you who are participating in the conference could easily have been asked to do multiple sessions given the different hats that you wear. So the point is to have a general discussion in which everyone in the room feels free to engage with the issues that the panelists raise. Finally, I wanted to note that, as you have seen, this conference is being video recorded. The reason for that is that given this experimental form of the conference, with no formal papers but only conversations, we realized that the conference would have no durable existence unless it were recorded. So just in case our conversations do produce real insights that we feel like other people might want to know about, and we feel like pursuing some experimental form of publication out of this conference, maybe along with the other conferences, we wanted to retain the at least ability to do that. So this is a formal announcement that you will be videotaped this weekend. If you object to that, rather than having you all fill out little waivers, if you object to that, please let me know right now, or come to me in private and let me know, and I will arrange to turn off the camera. All right, I think that's it for my prefatory remarks. So let me turn things over to James for a few minutes, and then after that we can proceed to the first session of the day. James.
This is grossly I'm going to just turn this off. Can I turn it off? No. It's grossly... Oh, this is... over here. Thank you. It's very unfair in a way for me to get landed with the job of saying what the intellectual rationale of this conference is.
Is this not going to work at all?
We got it. We're recording.
Oh.
Not facing you so much.
Okay.
We'll put it way down here.
Okay. Let me start again. Let's remind ourselves that we are actually standing and working in a public university. We're trying very hard to keep it a public university. It isn't a gentleman's club, and neither is it a security state. And I hope that you all take very seriously the protests and the marches yesterday and support as well you can your colleagues as graduate students, faculty, and students at other campuses. Okay, party political broadcast over. Why are we talking about the state? We're talking about the state because it's been a central question in British history, and it's been a central question in British history primarily because it seemed to be a key indicator of a process of modernisation. So it seems to me that the historiography has been continually preoccupied with the question of when does a modern state emerge in Britain. So I'm going to give you like a very quick rehearsal of those debates. First of all, of course, there's the debate about Elton's revolution in government in the Tudor era, and how you get from the sort of late medieval dispersal of authority to the Leviathan. Okay, a central question in the early modern period. Then, of course, there's the debates around the emergence of the fiscal military state in in the 18th century. Then there's the next revolution in government was, of course, the mid-Victorian one, the work of MacDonagh and people, and the emergence of what we might characterize as a type of civil state in the 19th century. And then finally, of course, the emergence of welfare regimes and the welfare state in the 20th century, and more recently through the work of David Edgerton, the idea of a warfare state. So it seems to me that all of those debates are really critically preoccupied with the transformation of authority and state power, trying to grapple with the question of when do we get a modern state. So, so that's some of the backdrop that I imagine that we'll be in conversation with over the weekend. Seems to me that another, and this is certainly true of the modern period, and incidentally, one of the animating forces of this colloquium has been an attempt to try and put modernists and early modernists in conversation with each other. This is the great argument about how modern was the early modern period, and with us modernists trying to say no, really. Yeah, it seems to me that those debates have also been critical to a story of British exceptionalism. They're trying, in many cases, to refute the story of exceptionalism, but it seems to me that the state is a central part of an argument about the peculiarly liberal nature of British society. It's the sort of the miracle cure to how Britain combines rapid commercial and economic modernization with imperial expansion and, at least from the 18th century on, relative political stability. The state is seen to be the sort of magic pill that enables Britain to get away with that. And even though I think that some of the work that I just indicated pushes against it, it's that story of exceptionalism is still rooted strong. I'm thinking, for instance, of the work of Martin Daunton on, I forget what the name of the book is, about taxation. Trusting Leviathan, something like that. No, Just Taxes, Trusting Leviathan, in which we get exactly that story, in fact. So I'm not going to go through why it is we're having each of these sub-panels, because I'm hoping that will be fairly self-evident how these themes speak to these broader issues that I've been trying to outraise. The one question that we're not asking, and the one question that we should perhaps certainly be asking, and I hope we'll come back to continually throughout the question, is the very obvious one of what is the state? And certainly, over the last generation, there's been a huge amount of theoretical work raising this issue that historians are slowly beginning to catch up to. And of course, the work of Foucault and Bourdieu have both been critical in saying, look, this view of the state as a leviathan, the state as in a sort of greedy competition for power and the monopoly of violence against civil society, is a sort of chimera. And it's made us all be looking at the wrong way, thinking in the wrong way about the way that power works. So I hope that at least this weekend we'll try and think hard about what it is that we mean by the state. We certainly shouldn't, I think, take the state as a self-evident category, and I hope that each of our panels shows us how wrong-headed that would be to do. So there is my party political broadcast. Over to the panel.
I'm going to take this microphone and move it rather than dispensing with it. I think that should work. So let me just briefly introduce the four members of this panel. And I've wrote out these introductions largely based upon your Wikipedia entries or the equivalent. So pardon me for any errors that may result. Brian Levac is the John E. Green Regents Professor in History at the University of Texas at Austin. His first book was a 1973 study of civil lawyers in 17th century England, an interest which brought him quickly to the study of witchcraft, on which he has since written or edited 3 books, most recently Witch Hunting in Scotland, Law, Politics, and Religion in 2008. But most importantly for the theme of this conference, he is the author of The Formation of the British State, England, Scotland, and the Union, 1603 to 1707, 1991. Mike Braddock is Professor of History at the University of Sheffield. He received his PhD from Cambridge University and since then has written several books, including 2 on the subject of this conference directly, The Nerves of State, Taxation and the Financing of the English State, 1558 to 1700, published in 1996, and State Formation in Early Modern England, published in 2000. He's also written extensively on empire and the British Atlantic world, and on the English Revolution of the mid-17th century. Most recently, in 2008, he published the new Penguin history of that subject entitled God's Fury, England's Fire, a new history of the English Civil Wars. Your title?
It's an old title, but a very new interpretation.
David Lieberman is the Jefferson E. Pizer Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley. But despite that title, we like to claim him as a historian. He received his PhD from the University of London in 1980 and since then taught for many years at Cambridge before coming here. He's the author of The Province of Legislation Determined Legal Theory in 18th Century Britain in 1990, and many articles on English and Scottish political theory. And most recently, he's completed a critical edition of Jean-Louis Delhome's 1771, The Constitution of England, or an account of the English government. Jordana Belkin is Associate Professor of History at the University of Washington. She received her PhD from Stanford in 1998, and since then she's written extensively on liberalism, the British Empire, and the impact of decolonization on Britain in the 20th century. Her book, The Culture of Property, The Crisis of Liberalism in Modern Britain, was published by Chicago in 2004. All right, so let's get started and see what happens. We should, I think, go in rough chronological order, so I think that puts Brian first.
So one of our assignments as panelists is to address the question, what was the state? I doubt we're going to agree on a definition, and I don't think it's terribly important that we do. And the reason I say this is that the state is a construct that historians and political scientists use as a category of analysis, and different definitions serve different heuristic and scholarly purposes. We use the term the state to describe different political entities, sources of political authority, or arrangements for rule. When we refer to church-state relations in the Middle Ages, for example, we're conceiving of the state in the very general terms of secular as opposed to ecclesiastical authority. When we use the term in an international context, such as when we refer to all the states of Europe or the origins of the state system after the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, we are thinking of autonomous political units that have diplomatic relationships with other states. When we use the term to describe the administration of a polity, we use it to identify a set of bureaucratic institutions, which are very often referred to as the state apparatus. When we're discussing political theory, we use the term in its most abstract sense to identify the legitimizing authority of a polity, such as Hobbes's Leviathan, which of course seems to be the word that we always use to describe at least the early modern state. The different ways that we construct the state also explain why we often qualify it by identifying its features or its functions. Hence we have the absolutist state, the fiscal military state, the nation state, the welfare state, the social service state, the warfare state. There are only a few common elements in these different concepts or constructions of the state. One is that the state refers to a sovereign or autonomous political entity. Another is that the authority of the state is exercised through the law. The state, unlike the nation, with which it is often identified and confused, is a coercive political entity. A third element, which works its way into all definitions, or at least most definitions, is that its sovereign power is exercised over a geographically defined area. So this brings us to our question of this session: where is the state? Not just what are its territorial boundaries, but over what area does it exercise its sovereign political power? Let me suggest that it's easier to locate the state in smaller political units, such as the ancient Greek city-states of Athens and Corinth, the Renaissance city-states of Venice and Florence, and the numerous German states within the Holy Roman Empire, than in the larger political formations of the early modern and modern periods, where the exercise of sovereign power is often contested both in peripheral areas and in small towns and villages. Once we start talking about national states, composite states, and federal states, we use the term the state. The use of the term the state becomes problematic. And this is especially true in Britain. Once the English government brought the North and the West, that is Wales, within the ambit of central governmental control, in the English state in the 16th century, as part of the English state in the 16th century, that state began to lose some of its unitary features, especially having to establish regional courts in Wales and in the north, instead of bringing them within the ambit of the common law system. Concessions such as this became even more striking when England and Scotland were united in 1707. I have described this entity as the British state, but it was hardly the type of political entity that existed in ancient Athens, in Renaissance Florence, or 17th century Bavaria, or even the state that emerged in England in the 16th century. This British state had to accommodate two very different, some would say incompatible, legal systems to mediate the tenuous authority of Westminster, and it had to accommodate two established, or what we would call state churches, one of them far more Erastian than the other. No wonder that contemporaries did not define this British polity as a state. The problem of conceiving of or of constructing a British state becomes even more difficult when we discuss the incorporation of Ireland into this composite British polity in 1801. Historians tend not to use the term state to identify this expanded version of the United Kingdom. Instead, they use the language of empire, which they also use to describe the more far-flung overseas possessions of the crown. In so doing, they distinguish between the metropolis, or the metropole, a term meaning in Greek mother state, to identify the core of this empire. They identify this metropolis as Britain, but never, to my knowledge, as a state that includes Ireland. The territorial boundaries of the British state can only be stretched so far.
Thanks. I'm at a disadvantage, I guess, in that I've got strong views about this. I started work on the state facing a problem similar to what Krishnamurti describes for seven blindfolded men, trying to capture the essence of an elephant, that the one holding the tail says it's like a snake, the one holding the tusk says it's like a branch, another one holding the leg says it's like a tree trunk. And early modern literature invokes the state in such different contexts and so rarely tries to relate them as a single body that you end up with quite different versions of what the state is for. So that if you compare the state in the school of Keith Wrightson as an instrument of social discipline with the state in the work of the John Brewer School as a fiscal military enterprise designed to generate overseas trade and possession, you're talking about quite different parts of the elephant, it seems to me, rather than completely different bodies. Similarly, if within each of these traditions quite different narratives of change evolve, the Elton version of modernity applies to certain parts of the elephant and not to other parts of the elephant. So my question in resolving these different characterizations of the state and different narratives to which they gave rise forced me to think about what I meant by the state, which is why I've come essentially to this roundtable with a closed mind. However, you can learn from me. In whatever way, I'll leave for you to decide. I return to Weber, as most people do, but I return to Weber, I think, with a slightly different set of concerns. It seems to me that Weber's classic definition of the state in Politics as a Vocation emphasizes, explicitly discounts function as a way of characterizing the state. States have done all sorts of different things over time, and yet we still recognize them to be states. And any attempt to define a state in terms of function seems to me to imply a tautology. So Steve Hindle's definition of the state, which I'm going to return to several times, refers to the state as a means of organized system of subjection. And then, of course, you go to the documents and you look for evidence of subjection, and it becomes a tautological circular argument. If you define the end, then the argument has become a closed loop. So Weber avoided that by not defining the state in terms of function. Instead, he defined the state in terms of the power that it exercised. Political power. Political power differs from economic power, it differs from familial power, it differs from the power of gender, because it's territorial, it's backed ultimately by the threat of legitimate political force, and it resides in offices. Offices are acquired not by birth, not by possession of a particular set of genitals, or any of those other means. It's a politically organized means of exercising agency over or with others. So, the key to the Weberian definition, it seems to me, is that the essence of the state is the kind of power which it exercises. And that power is ultimately backed by violence, not by economic or other force. It's territorially bounded because offices have to be defined in terms of territory, and it can be functionally extremely diverse. The state can train 100 meters runners, it can run hospitals, it can build A-bombs, but it doesn't have to do any of those things or all of them. What it has in common across all the things we recognize to be states is this control of political power. Now, I know there's another roundtable on violence, so I won't talk about violence, and I won't talk about the problems of relating this to other forms of power to which state actors lay claim. That'll all have to come in the discussion. In my own work on the state, I was primarily concerned with how people resist the state. I started with an interest in popular politics. And it seemed to me that the key issue here was to get past the model of coercion that James has already talked about, where an emphasis on the violent basis of state authority leads you to explore violent resistance to the state. In fact, violence is particular to the state, but it's not its normal means of operation. Ultimately, you pay a parking fee because otherwise you'll end up in clink, and if you resist the clink, you can end up with an even worse state-sanctioned punishment. But that's not actually how state power really works. Violence is the ultimate sanction, not the normal means of operation, and it's peculiar to the state. You don't pay your rent to your landlord. You don't, in my daughter's case, do what your father tells you anyway, but you don't do what your father tells you to as a result of the threat of violent force. So violent force is peculiar to the state, but it's not its normal means of operation. So in my work on the state, I was then trying to reintroduce some of the questions that people had asked in the past. When did the state get modern? Whose interests did the state represent? My interest was how in securing compliance, people laying claim to state authority let in other kinds of social interests, race, class, gender, or in the current polity, the extraordinarily malign influence of Manchester United. Now, all this, it strikes me, is very orthodox Weberianism as relates to what the state is, but it's incorporated some of the work that James has referred to, Bourdieu, Foucault, on the actual operations of the state, on the experience of the state, on its local realities, and so forth. It doesn't seem to me that there's a tension necessarily between the postmodernists and the high priest of modernism on this. In politics as a vocation, Weber is laying out the state realm and saying that's where politics happens, and Weber, and then Foucault and Bourdieu, Deleuze and others are talking about how politics works within that realm. Now, following from all this, for those of you still alert to my words of wisdom, where is the state is a relatively straightforward question to answer if you're of my mind. The state is anywhere that its authority is successfully invoked. My interest here is in the issue of agency, and again I return to Steve Hindle, whose work I admire and who as a person I admire, but unfortunately it just turns out that I'm going to have a go at him twice today. Steve has sentences in his treatment of the state which include statements such as the state wanted or the state thought. It seems to me the state doesn't have agency. The state is a reservoir of political power on which people draw for particular purposes, and in doing so they express their own interests, race, class, gender, Manchester United and so forth. Politics, it seems to me, is a struggle to deploy state power and to lend it agency, and anywhere where you successfully invoke the authority of the state, then the state is present. So the state is not central, it's not local, it's pervasive, and that seems to me to be more Foucauldian view than a Weberian view, although, as I say, to me, they don't seem necessarily to be in tension. Now, within England, the unity question Brian raised is not so problematic. It's clearly problematic in the context that Brian raised it. But again, the agency issue gets us to some extent past the unity issue, although I wouldn't suggest this is a response to what Brian has said. But for those of you of a certain age, you'll remember that one of Sheffield's proudest exports was a giant steel tube with a rifle barrel with which it would have been possible to fire a giant bullet from Baghdad to, let's say, Tel Aviv. It was manufactured in Sheffield, and it was licensed for export by the Department of Trade and Industry. Someone at Customs and Excise either disapproved of this as arms trading by illicit means, or just for political reasons, and blocked the export. So two arms of the state are clearly in opposition to each other, with the result that the executive was excruciatingly embarrassed for selling arms to Saddam Hussein. Doesn't mean there's no state, I presume. It means that the state is not always unitary. It means that there is a struggle to deploy the power of the state for one purpose or another, to develop regional development, to support regional development in Sheffield, to support the steel industry in a time of crisis, versus a moral view of Middle Eastern policy, if that's what the Customs and Excise were actually up to. So I think the advantage of seeing the state as a kind of network of power is that it makes some of these agency issues easier, and makes some of these unity issues easier, and makes some of the location issues easier as a result. However, what it doesn't make very easy is the when was the state question. It seems to me that you can have a network of political power that has all these characteristics, and still decide that state is not the best term for that particular form of political power. When I wrote my stuff on this, I was embarrassed by the fuzzy edges of the early modern states, the East India Company, for example. And that seemed to pose a problem of justification. How can you call this a state by comparison with the nice, clean, bureaucratic, shiny, steel-like operations of the modern industrial state? I think that problem has become less marked, or at least it's become a problem for modernists as well, because so much modern state activity, what we think of as state activity, is now subcontracted. So just as the 17th century subcontracted, apparently, state activities to actors which problematically defined as parts of the state, so too the modern state. But in any case, I think the approach I laid out here is reasonably strong in addressing questions of agency, unity, and location. I don't think it necessarily is as strong in justifying or coming up with a strong answer to the question of when was the state. But fortunately, Ethan didn't ask me to talk about that.
David?
Okay, thanks. We've been asked to think broadly and comparatively, and somewhat inevitably I retreat to what's familiar, which for me means the institutions of law and also the period of the long 18th century. The law is not the same thing as the state, but it does seem that a good way to begin, or at least from my parochial perspective in thinking about where is the state, is to ask the question, where is the law? If I got it right, the formulation Mike Braddock used in his remarks when he said the state is anywhere where it is invoked. Often when it is invoked and when it is invoked and mobilized through the institutional apparatus of the legal order. A major problem in the British context of thinking about the law as a way into the state is that, of course, the law is not British, or the law takes a very long time to become British. And in that way, my approach here evades the challenge, the important challenge that Brian Levac began the panel with, which is to think about the unity and the problems of composite states, federal states, and imperial states. The law, of course, is both this enormously large institutional apparatus, and the law is one of the major institutional apparatus, though not the exclusive one, for linking the locality with the center, though if I wear my law hat rather than my historical hat, the center here emphatically includes the courts of Westminster Hall rather than the kingship or the crown alone or parliament alone. And of course, the law is an important conceptual apparatus for the description of the society and for the description of relationships and roles and practices within that society. When thinking about this assignment, I was very struck that although by the late 17th century, commentators in Britain, as in Europe, are used to thinking about a polarity or dualism between church and state, so that you can think in the manner of Warburton about an alliance between church and state, or in the manner of Jefferson about a separation of church and state. I don't think it's until quite a bit later that people start talking in Britain about the law and the state, as opposed to law and constitution. And I take that as partly a product of the interpenetration of the state and the law. When people think about the law and the Constitution, often the question is how much of the legal order should be included into the Constitution of the kingdom. That is to say, trial by jury, yes, habeas corpus, yes, but what about other legal processes? What about other legal arrangements? One reason for adopting this legal perspective is that it seems to me a good way into some very general questions about the state and the operations and activities of the state, particularly, I think, in the British context, although I've already said something about the parochial English framework here. One is about the nature of the coordination of the various branches of the state or parts of the apparatus of the state and how this coordination is achieved. The English legal system, well into the Victorian era, is this myriad patchwork of surviving historical elements. If one looks at the basic units, the familiar tithings, parishes, counties, duchies, even a palatine. If one looks at courts, local courts, manorial courts, municipal courts, ecclesiastical courts, all the way up. From the perspective of certain Victorian reformers, it's a mess. It is a system liable to abuse. But from a comparative perspective, it is a remarkably consolidated and coordinated order, an insight that becomes clear when you read French physiocratic writing or German cameralist writing about the English state. And the mechanisms are there for coordinating these various institutions, notwithstanding the abuses and delays and fabulous expense that can be a part of navigating them. Second, the legal order, and again, I think this has implication for the state, relies on enormous numbers of unpaid, part-time, and untrained officials. Sheriffs, constables, magistrates, justices of the peace, as well as organized groups of unpaid officials like juries. That is one reason why the English legal order, in contrast to its continental counterparts, can have very few high-ranking officials. And the great contrast is always used is that the High Court, Central Courts of Westminster Hall, usually employ somewhere between 12 and 15 royal judges. The Parliament of Paris usually has a couple of hundred. If you went through the structure of French courts, you get up to 1,000 judges. Finally, there's the process by which so much change and development occurs through a kind of opportunistic incrementalism which layers new institutions and new functions on existing institutional process and additional procedure. The 18th century reform of municipal government occurs by layering on new jurisdictions, new institutions, new corporate bodies on top of pre-existing ones, rather than by systematically reorganizing local government in areas of population density. All this seems to me to make it hard to identify the boundaries, if we mean by the state, in the way Mike Braddock indicated, where does it end? Where does it achieve closure? That's very hard because of the porousness, because of the overlap, because of the untrained officials. And it also means tracking change and identifying change becomes tricky, particularly when one relies on certain kinds of familiar records. I'm going to make this concrete very quickly through a particular example, and then I'll end. My example is criminal justice, because criminal justice is one of those areas where the relationship between law and politics, the interests of the state and the operations of the law are very closely and usually explicitly tied. One of the features, an indirect, a secondary consequence of the fiscal military state, or the consolidation of parliamentary government, as it was once called, is that the state in the long 18th century makes law, and makes law at a much more rapid pace than at any previous time in English history, and because of procedural changes I won't go into, in a way, at any time in English history. This legislation is local, much of it is private, it deals with particular groups and particular projects and so on. It is very much a reactive process by which central government responds. In the area of criminal justice, there's a well-known story, which is the change in sanctions, the creation of the bloody code, the increasing deployment of the threat of capital punishment for the commission of property and increasingly minor property offenses. But another transformation, which perhaps had a more pervasive impact on the legal order, was the extension of summary justice. That is the empowering of local magistrates, justice of the peace, to handle minor offenses without utilizing juries, without acting in alliance in quarter session, without relying on the assize. Summary justice, summary jurisdiction involved a major transformation in the law concerning proof, the law of evidence, and the way in which state power was used to handle not just property offenses, but large connected areas, such as the law of master and servant. This has now been studied by some really, from historians I've learned a lot, John Beatty, Peter King, Bruce Smith, and so on, who have suggested the whole creation of a kind of low-level secondary system of criminal justice that leaves very little recorded trace because of its summary nature. It seems to me, we can think of here as the state being mobilized in terms of one institutional apparatus, the justice of the peace, as opposed to another, the common law jury or the local court. It's an important point to the way in which the state was evoked, where the state was, but the state is working in a way that's so porous between official, non-official, full-time state actor, part state, part-time, private amateur. And I'll end.
Jordana.
So this task of trying to pinpoint the location of the state took me back to another Mellon conference that was held here in Berkeley a few years ago in 2006. And many things that happened to the book I was working on then were either the fault or the credit of that workshop. I haven't totally decided which one yet. Because what happened was after I raced through my 10 minutes that time, talking about some preliminary ideas for this book on decolonization and social science and the state, James Vernon asked me what I thought was a very compelling question, although also a somewhat devastating one. Why, he asked, is the scholarship on decolonization so boring? Now, of course, I hoped and believed that the unspoken end of that sentence was, except for yours, of course. At the time, I said I wasn't sure, but I thought it had something to do with the structure of the archives for post-war history, and in particular, the politics of declassification and what types of documents about the end of empire have been released and what documents have been retained. So 3 years later, I wanted to elaborate a little bit on that answer and think about it specifically in relation to this bigger question of where is the state and where was the state. Historians have seen decolonization as being driven by states, but states only in a very narrow sense. That is, a kind of diplomatic push and pull between, on the one hand, nationalist independence movements, and on the other hand, the strategic mistakes and maneuvers of the former colonial powers. And it's really a very anticlimactic story. I think for anyone acquainted with the kind of drama and passion and richness of the scholarship on colonial states, it's a fairly sedate story that tends to focus on exactly when the British state woke up and acknowledged the sea change that was taking place all around it. So in the context of that scholarship, the state has involved a very constrained set of players, cabinet, the colonial office, and occasionally the foreign office. So I wanted to pose another set of methodological questions, which are really questions about the contours of the archive, or the perceived contours of the archive, for thinking about the state in the 20th century. How do we know what we know about the British state? Where do we look to find out about the state? And how might our options be changing in the wake of the most recent Freedom of Information Acts? And in particular, how has this particular path of declassification, shaped what we're able to see about the British state, and especially about the end of empire? I think it's interesting that it was during the era of decolonization that the British state became perhaps most explicit about being both an object and a creator of archives. And I'm thinking here for state documents about the 50-year rule that was established by the Public Records Act of 1958, which was amended then to the 30-year rule in 1967. But one of the big shifts in the last few years, one of the big archival shifts for people who are interested in the history of the state, is that under Freedom of Information 2000, which was just enacted in 2005, people have, for the first time, the right to appeal decisions to withhold information. And the other big shift in 2005 is that for the first time, the security services, the intelligence services, were exposed to archival inquiry. They had always been shielded in 58 and 67. So that's been one sort of interesting development of the last few years, is that the intelligence files have come open. A lot of them, I think, have turned out to be sort of disappointingly dull and technical, which maybe warns us to be wary of treating declassification as revelation or as automatic revisionism. But I think that the main critique of FOI by historians has focused on how the acts still don't go far enough, and how they continue to hide behind national security exemptions that can retain documents for up to 100 years on the grounds of national security. Now, interestingly, it's often those same scholars and activists who also champion exemptions for the privacy of individuals, which is enshrined both in FOI and also in the Data Protection Act of 1998. And what this has meant in practice is a kind of blinkered asymmetry about where we look to find the state's domain, in that the existing archives now are actually more forthcoming more quickly about state secrets than about personal ones, or what appear to be personal secrets. Does the state even still have secrets anymore? And if so, where does it keep them? I wonder about that because in the hundreds of National Archives files that I've seen many testimonies, very open testimonies to all of the wrongdoings and all of the violence of the British state. Framing of Irish migrants for false terrorism charges, cases where individuals were wrongly labeled mentally ill and forcibly repatriated. All of that kind of conspiracy and violence is very readily accessible to us. It's very forthcoming in the cabinet papers and the Home Office documents. Most of the information I've had trouble accessing, or the denials that I've faced, have been under Section 38 of FOI. That is, that the file could endanger an individual's physical or mental health or safety. Or Section 40, that protects personal information when an individual would have no reason to think that that information would become public. Only twice have I been denied access to a file because of Section 27, which is what I expected going into a project on the 50s and 60s, that I would get a lot of denials under Section 27. That's that the file could damage relations between Britain and another state. And that's only happened twice, both cases for Malaysia. But the denials for files on individuals are much trickier because of the way in which the state is present and hidden in these files as well. In thinking about where we find the decolonizing state, we have to look not only to Cabinet and Home Office papers, I think, but also to files on individuals, files from the Children's Department, Metropolitan Police, National Insurance, all of which have previously been cloaked by personal data protection. Now, my point here, as much as I'd like to know what's in the files that remain closed to me, is not that we should axe all exemptions for personal information. But the bigger question, I think, is how state archives make determinations about which documents pertain to individuals and which documents pertain to states. So the state is still making its own call about where we can even locate its presence in the first place and where it can continue to be absent. Now, I've seen some of these personal files, which has been a really random and uneven process because it's mostly for individuals who have no living descendants. But having seen a few of these personal files, I would say it's precisely in them that the complexities of decolonization reside, and more particularly the diversity of the state's efforts to govern decolonization. We can really only see those aspects of the 20th century state by bringing these personal files into the picture. So, for example, in lawsuits by individual polygamous wives from newly independent regions of West Africa, Their lawsuits to obtain maternity benefits or widows' benefits from the British state. We can see in these files the range of the state's investment in decolonization. And that's a range that extends way beyond the diplomatic realm and into the spheres of metropolitan family law, criminal law, education, and health. But more importantly, I think we can see something through these files that's been occluded in the history of the 20th century state, which is we can see the intersection or even the intertwining of what have typically been taken as divergent topics of post-war British history, and that is decolonization and the welfare state. We can see now these themes intertwined in new ways and put the welfare state in a global lens. What these files render visible is the interaction between local demands and global demands in the making of the welfare state, and the extent to which seemingly domestic welfare policies were actually shaped by the needs or the perceived needs of decolonization. Another way to put this is that we can use these sources, these newly accessible sources, to see the sphere of the social within decolonization, and to give the welfare state a new geography, charting on the one hand its proximity to, but also I think its unseen dependence on the end of empire, and to break up the locations of the welfare state's construction and to map them or disperse them onto the former empire and the new world order that emerged in its place. Thanks.
Thank you. That was great. This makes me very happy. So right, there are lots of things to follow up on, and I had been assuming that I would follow up on the sort of obvious debate that's in shape here between Mike Braddock's definition of the state being anywhere its authority is invoked and other issues of empire and so forth. But before I do that, actually, both David and Jordana brought up this issue of sources, and it strikes me that since we're a bunch of historians and not a bunch of political scientists or sociologists sitting here, it's worth talking about that maybe first, and whether the state is where the sources are, and that's in a positive sense, that's what states do, is they create archives, or whether the state is blinding us through these sources to other forms of power or other ways we might see the state. Are we missing where the state really is because what we get are legal records and what we have are Freedom of Information Acts, and we have county records in the early modern period, but we don't have the sort of robust records of everyday life? Are we missing something here?
The archives.
Steve?
Well, I wanted to.
I think I was very struck by working on tax, and I was interested in tax as a political thing. As I came from a, broadly speaking, Marxist background where tax was a form of state appropriation, and so tax is an act of power. And there the act of power is in the recording in a way that Bourdieu wrote brilliantly about, I think, in State Magic, where someone constitutes a new social reality by recording it in a particular way. You're licensed to create reality through the archive. And I think that's a tremendously powerful way of thinking about the state. But I don't think that's the only way the state acts. I mean, I think it's clearly very important and it's crucial to the agency of state actors that they're able to constitute the categories through which people are. I mean, currently, endless negotiation in Britain about whether someone is a genuine asylum seeker or an economic migrant. That comes down to a moment where a form is filled in, and then suddenly someone's life is reconstituted in a particular way. So clearly, the act of recording and the archive is a crucial exercise of power. But I'm reluctant to think that's the only place to look for state action.
But I do think what we can see in those archives is not the only sphere of state action, but it is it's a key to the taxonomies that structure state action in the first place, so that you can see this kind of expert production of fantasy by the state of how it thinks the state should act and the way in which it imagines the population that it governs. So there's there's the element of fantasy in all of these archives, and I think Ann Stoller talks about this compellingly, that the archives are a record of not what happened, but what could happen or should happen as much as what did happen. And I think that where that element perhaps is most visible for the 20th century is precisely in the invention of the kinds of categories you mentioned. Whether you talk about someone as an economic migrant or a refugee depends in part on the state drawing knowledge from other kinds of experts, like social scientists, or they vary by era, but pulling in information from other sources and then kind of reconstituting it as policy.
Steve?
Yeah, but I think that's sort of a misreading of Ann Stoller's recent work. Her recent work was to emphasize conflict at the center of it. So to talk about the state as a thing is precisely something that she would object to. And it strikes me that's what her new work is all about. And it strikes me that fits in very nicely with Mike's notion of the state as a site of conflict. So you can't talk about the state creating an archive. You can talk about different elements, different actors within the state, different people competing for the state to create archives. And in fact, what you get are competing archives. So I think what in fact one needs to do is to think about knowledge production as one among many sites of instantiation of conflict within the state. And I think that's why one needs to get beyond sort of an old institutional economics framework. Which I think was deeply influenced by a different kind of post-structuralism to the new kind of understanding of institutions created by conflict, which is, strikes me as central for like Sheila Ogilvy's new work, of theorizing the state and the sort of critiques of stuff of work of people like Gary Cox. And it strikes me that Ann Stoller specifically, in her critique of Gary Cox's work, exactly made this point. But I don't know, maybe I misread Ann Stoller's work.
She will carry you.
Maybe I can tie into this comment. But I think in terms of, if you look at, and this might be one way of thinking about changes in the state, you take precisely the idea of defining, for instance, who's an economic refugee and who's not. That's a decision that now is made by state bureaucrats in a certain way that is systematized, but previously was made by extended philanthropists and various other people pre-1905, but even after 1905, and so there still is a sort of, and these are people taking part in who's going to remain within the state, but they are not themselves, elected officials or appointed officials necessarily. So that's a way in which that state, and these are people who also debate who should be and who shouldn't be let in. So the question becomes, again, another way in which the state is contested at the same time at which it's actually exercising its final authority to take people in or kick people out as well. So I guess to look at that as a way of changes over time in terms of either strengthening or diversification or an incorporation of other actors into the state.
I mean, it gets us. I'm sorry.
I'm just saying that going back to the whole question of the relationship between archives that are created by the state and the nature of the state. We've also talked certainly David and I both talked a lot about the importance of the law as the way in which state authority is exercised and imposed and mediated. And it would seem to me that you could argue that the construction of a state in the early modern period, at least, is greatly determined by the body of legal records that are there, because those are the statements of the means by which state power is exercised. And people can go back to that, and if they want to understand what what the state is, they can say, well, it is a state that actually has exercised this criminal justice, for example. So I think there is a relationship between records and this whole idea of how people conceive of or construct a state. Yeah.
Let me play devil's advocate for just 1 sec, and then go, in the sense that there's a question here, it strikes me, of whether these records are the state and the state is important, or whether the records are actually the state trying to disguise or hide other things, right? I mean, a Foucauldian version of this, not that it's my version, but a Foucauldian version of this is that archives hide governmentality and put the sort of the cloak of government over a more general governmentality, and that power operates actually in lots of different ways through lots of different sorts of agency, and the state sort of has an interest in hiding that and claiming centrality. So thinking about the early modern period that Brian just mentioned, I was thinking about all of the people, so the state creates these legal records, and then individuals involved in lawsuits go search them for precedents. Powerful, wealthy people with access thus win cases. Poorer people without access lose cases, and the state as an apparatus tends to the benefit of certain classes of people. Right. At one level, okay, archives represent state power, but on another level, perhaps the archives are hiding all sorts of other governmentality, right? That the archive is producing the appearance that courts and law operate in this way, but in fact are a way of cloaking other ways that power operates in society. That's something. Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't disagree with that, but it seems odd to say it's the state that's doing the cloaking rather than the people who are using state power for their own purposes, cloaking their own purposes by, deploying state power. It's a question of where the agency comes from, I think.
I'm also concerned with the presumption that there is a single discernible entity called state power or the state. Because even when the state is exerting power, it is often being exerted by local officials, and it's often settled at a local level. Indeed, a lot of what passes for state power, particularly in the early modern period, but right into the 19th century, it's actually local disputes going on, where sometimes there are clear-cut examples of what appears to be a central state operating as, in Mike's schema without consent. I'm thinking particularly Operation of Customs and Excise, which wherever it appears in the British Isles, right down to certainly the 1830s, 1840s, it's appearing as an external power, and there's you can have the entire local community resisting it. It's like an act of collective resistance. We will hide the whiskey. We will hide the imported gin from Rotterdam. We'll, in one case in Shetland, they hid it in the basement of the parish church, the gin. So you've got this example. The state is like an invading power. Now, in terms of accessing this kind of observation, I think it's much better at local record level, the local archive. You can see these divisions much better than if you just relied on central state records. Certainly in Scotland, I think we're blessed with fantastic local history sources, particularly, can I say, for Orkney and Shetland, which have got the best records in the whole of the UK, because you've got all court cases have survived, all the way down to procurator fiscal cases. So you can actually see the small operation of the state in tiny, tiny things, as well as in the large cases. But I'm concerned that in relation to the state appearing as a single entity, it actually operates through a series of different agencies. It operates through the churches, which we'll come on to in another session, customs and excise. But I mean, I would just finish with a statistic. I was told by an economic historian that in 1850, only 2% of the British population were paying income tax. But I would reckon 100% were paying church taxes. And they're done locally.
It seems to me that the panel necessarily is engaged in trying to segregate the state from other things in order to identify it and define it. And as I look at the early modern period that I studied, 16th and 17th century, it seems to me in some way that is a perverse exercise, because I think that you have to look at 3 and perhaps more interrelated things to get a sense of what is happening. And those 3 things are the state apparatus, or what's called the apparatus of government. Let's not assign it to the state, because I think that's part of the problem. The second, I think, is the pervasiveness of dynastic kingship, in which the notion that at least a part of the governmental apparatus, if not all, is something that belongs to a person, and it devolves in a hereditary fashion. And many of the political problems of that early modern period involve questions of succession, and of royal marriages, which may involve the combination, the composite state. And then the third thing is this, which we are avoiding, is the sense of either nationhood and of being English or not English. Certainly at that level, the English certainly do not feel themselves to be part of the Scottish community, nor do they feel an identity with the Irish. So I do think that somehow, while it's worth trying to segregate out and define the state, when, as a historian, I find that is somehow perverse, because it is the melange of those three things that I think is important for understanding. And the institutions of the state are sometimes, or the institution of England, are sometimes claimed to belong to the person of the king, let's say the royal prerogative, as opposed to those things that don't adhere in the royal prerogative. So it seems to me as I look at that early modern period, it is the melange of things that are messed up that is so characteristic of that era. So that's my
Yeah, please.
I just like, since the last two speakers have just mentioned Scotland, and since this is obviously an issue of significance for me, I was just wanting to bring back the question of Scotland. And there was something that David said and Mike said that raises this question. You were talking about essentially English criminal justice, and weren't talking that much about Scottish criminal justice. And Mike was talking about the state, saying that the state is anywhere that the authority of the state is invoked. And I guess my question would be, in early 18th century Scotland, is the authority of which has its own separate criminal justice system, which has its own separate law, when could you imagine the authority of the British state being invoked in Scotland in a legal context? In other words, I guess what I'm questioning is that if we have this legal pluralism, does that mean that the British state is conceived of in a broad British sense, including England and Scotland, that state is in fact terribly fragile, if not non-existent? I mean, I can see how you're talking about the invocation of the state authority at a local level. I'm just trying to figure out when that would actually happen in Scotland in the early 18th century. That's sort of the problem I'm wrestling with.
You wanna respond?
Yeah.
That was where I wanted to go next.
Oh, really? Okay.
That's
Yeah.
great.
People are hopping around in the audience,
I
but
know.
I don't want to be tied to saying that there's a British state in the early 18th century. I mean, I haven't made that claim. How would you use my argument to deal with Scottish society in the early 18th century? Well, presumably people with conflicts to resolve or interests to express or material interests to promote lay claim to political power to do it. And exactly what I've described in England can be described for Scotland in a different set of institutions. I mean, the question you're posing is really about the jurisdictional relationship between those institutions in Scotland and those in England, and whether between that, in that articulation there is something that it's useful to describe as the British state. And there I simply don't know the jurisdictional answer. I don't know what happens if what the ultimate appeal in particular forms of conflict, or I don't know what that is. So I can't really answer the question. But I mean, I don't, and you know, let this be the last time I try and get you to believe what I believe. I've got another way of talking about it, which is someone else's work, and let's talk about someone else's work. Paul Halliday's recent work on habeas corpus, which says that habeas corpus is in fact not a territorial writ. It's about the right of the Crown to oversee the activity of anyone carrying out the Crown's business, and that and it opens up a whole new view of the relationship between legal authority and territory. I think. I mean, it's particularly he's been drawn into testimony in Guantanamo related business about whether people in Guantanamo have to answer habeas corpus demands and so forth. It seems a really helpful way of thinking about these spatial questions of political authority, and so I don't want to carry on defending my position.
That's it's a very interesting case, because what he argues in that book is that habeas corpus is also invoked in the empire, and it's one of the few ways in which central English or British power is actually exercised throughout the empire, if at least people can respond to the writ, which is another real problem.
Does habeas corpus run in Scotland? Can you?
Well, they have a separate statute in 1692, and so they use that. But eventually, that would be probably one example where someone would invoke the power of the state in Scotland. But generally, I think that people invoking the power of the state at the local level in Scotland would invoke the power of some kind of British polity, which remains relatively distinct and administratively distinct from that of Britain. So I guess the question is, when do we have a real British state, is when people in localities in Scotland are starting to invoke that authority that you're talking about. And I think that comes after the early 18th century. I think that's later. Maybe late 18th century, maybe early 19th century. I don't know. Steve is.
Well, no, it strikes. It strikes me. First of all, my view. My understanding of what Mike said was actually not just when the state is invoked, but when it's you said successfully invoked, and I think that's an interesting test case, because it does strike me that there's different levels in which the state might or might not be invoked with respect to Scotland. That is to say, from your perspective at the local level, and I'm entirely persuaded by what you say, that there are local issues, and I think this was Cullen's point about the church. But Tom Devine's guys acting in the empire, I think they're appealing to a very different level of the state, and they're appealing at sometimes to a British state, at sometimes not. So I think it does strike me, and it strikes me that the way you close your talk, Brian, by sort of saying, well, 1801 is described as an empire, also might raise this question about whether referring to a British state or an empire is precisely a political question, an area of conflict, which isn't always resolved in the same way. That in fact, the very kind of conflict which Mike was talking about is always a political question, and so the answer to where is the state is never answered definitively. It's always in an area of political contest, especially when you come to talking about Scotland. Certainly it's easy to see when you're talking about Scotland, Ireland, North America, the West Indies, India, etc. That strikes me as precisely an area of conflict. So when you look at it from the local level, you might get, when you're looking at who's paying church rates, for example, you're going to get some kind of a question. But if you look at something like regulating overseas commerce or not, you're going to get a different kind of question. So it strikes me that it's all about contest. So if one accepts Mike's model, which I'm happy to accept, I think I also come from this sort of various vaguely Marxist way of thinking about the state. It means that where is the state is something which you can never provide a definitive answer to. It's precisely that is what the stuff of politics is defining that question.
Right.
Oh wait, who?
Yeah, it's just a quick question. This is a question of sort of ignorance. Well, it's sort of comment, but then.
I'll hold it for you, Flight.
It's like karaoke. Here till Thursday. But in terms of the separate jurisdictions, aren't both systems of law sort of within the purview of the monarch and acceptable? Isn't that a way to sort of see them as being sort of bounded and thus kind of British in some way? And then I think, and that might help sort of get us out of some of that seeming sort of controversy that that you raise. But my real question was, I guess going back to Barbara Shapiro's question about sort of the rise of the nation and the state, and this does seem to me to be something that really needs to be looked at a bit more closely. And if I understand Brian Levac correctly, you can't really talk about the British state in Ireland, but taking Mike's definition, you certainly can. And it does seem to me, I'm quite sympathetic to Mike Braddock's position, and yet it's clearly a sort of British state in Ireland that looks very English. So there are these very odd sort of connections between them. I'm not sure what they are, but I wouldn't mind us trying to sort of pull them out a bit, because I think the slippage between kind of English and British already in our discussion of the state, I think is something that needs to really be looked at more closely.
Hands on this from the back. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess one way to think about this in terms of network theory and state would be to think about where British subjects. So in the British Empire and in India, by the 18th century, you have mayoral courts in the factory towns which are administering British law over British subjects. So we have institutions following British subjects and the East India Company and the British Empire throughout. And there are nice pithy little remarks in Hobson talking about having to go to war to protect British missionaries in the 19th century and how that kind of continues to expand the empire and regrets about the same. So one way to think about the state outside of this kind of established core is to think about how law follows these subjects and how also different natives can make claims upon English law in these mayoral courts. It's rather understudied for the 17th and 18th century, but people will bring themselves under those jurisdictions to make claims to certain kinds of British or English rights as well. And then it begins to shift our perception of what that core state would be or what the British state it might be when we have different actors making use of it.
I think there's another hand right there, yeah.
It seems to me that this, I'm going to call it the Braddock Thesis, has a lot of mileage in it with regards to the empire and the different ways in which state is invoked in Ireland, in Africa, in India. So, I mean, there's a paradox in that if violence is what ultimately underlies the state, it's exactly when certain kinds of violence are the ways in which the state is invoked that it looks like less of a state. So that would help to explain Ireland, at least partially. I should turn my Belfast accent on here a bit, actually. But, I mean, more generally, the question then is, what are the different modes by which the state can be invoked, and how do they differ in different places? I mean, if we're talking about where is the state? And I mean, the main set of examples I have in my head is British Central Africa in the decolonizing period, where I mean, you could easily imagine a situation where simply by having white skin or speaking English, you are invoking the power of the British state. Simply by being a mining corporation from South Africa, you are invoking the power of the British state. So it brings up not only empire, but questions of capital, relationship between the state and capital, or corporations, if you want to put it more specifically.
Do we feel the need to differentiate between empire and state in this context? I mean, surely all of these comments point out that if the state is anywhere its authority is successfully invoked, nowhere is it more successfully invoked than in Ulster in the 17th century, and surely, or in Bengal in the 18th century, or in,
And the people who come over to the plantation are listed as British.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, it strikes me that what makes those areas perhaps called empire rather than state is an ideological maneuver, because our state doesn't do that, right? And so perhaps our empire does. But do we feel the need to make that differentiation when we talk about the state and where was the state? Mark.
Well, I'm going to raise a curious example of this and let you answer the question, because I don't know the answer myself. But in North America in the 17th century, in New England in particular, you have these chartered corporate colonies who have been granted their charters by the king and then elaborate upon them in all kinds of ways, in some cases in violation of the instructions or rules. And then you have indigenous peoples of the same region who, in their own sort of negotiations, actually get themselves named and adopted as subjects by the crown, and then use that actually to say that they are invoking the state against Massachusetts, right? So, and the people in Massachusetts themselves are saying, yeah, we're not really that state, we're kind of our own. So there's this very tangled set of invocations by unlikely people and actually refusal to invoke an English state and say, no, we're actually sort of the kingdom of New England here. And so what's the answer? Where's the state there?
I have a question for Michael too. I mean, I share your no, but it's I share your Weberian proclivities about this, and I've learned a lot from your work, and it's this issue of kind of the porousness. I mean, I take it that Weber, but in the claim about the monopoly of violence, is still dealing with this idea that it's a unitary state or it's claiming exclusive jurisdictions. One of the helpful maneuvers about thinking about who invokes the agency of the state is that you're no longer burdened by this question. So in the case of Scotland, there is this fight over, say, hereditary jurisdictions. What is the criminal, what are the judicial authority of these Highland chiefs? And people are worrying about that for a long time, but eventually Parliament comes in and one side wins because it has the authority of a parliamentary statute. And that seems to me an important piece of state action or state power. But to suppose they finally, crack this particular nut through a particular legal measure doesn't mean that everything in Scotland is following suit or that it's all now what happens in Parliament. So I like that, but I must admit I do have this lingering worry about the porousness, that the state becomes everywhere. People invoke all kinds of normative orders when they're in conflict with other people. It's often in the world we know well, particularly strategic to invoke the state and the political order as the right set of institution, the right set of norms, but even in our world, that doesn't have exclusive monopoly. And if all we're looking for is the successful invocation and mobilization, it just seems to me, state becomes everywhere in a way that strikes me as illuminating some things, but then introducing other problems for scholarly inquiry as well.
I'm sorry, Jordana wanted to jump in.
No, go on. Well, I was just going to ask if maybe we're also focusing too narrowly on the question of violence, and the violence is the sole marker of the power of the state, because I think we could expand that to a more positive framework too, of thinking about the rights that come with the state and the benefits that are granted by the state. I mean, in an imperial locale as well as in a metropolitan one, the evocation of the state's authority is not only through the ultimate threat of violence, it's also for, the whole doctrine of development, right, and all of the things that are offered through the state, and the carrot as well as the stick. So, we've all kind of sort of tended towards talking about this violence. Partly that came out of the discussion of sources, I think, and what we think of as being hidden by the state. And I just wanted to sort of issue a reminder about the benefits that the state pretends to offer and actually does offer in all of these different settings. Right.
Yeah, I agree. I think I can't remember. I think I'm right in saying that Weber says the monopoly of legitimate violence. There's no claim that the state is the only violent actor, and so much of politics is about legitimation, not about violence. And part of that can be whether state violence can be legitimately defended, and there are cases where state power retreats because it can't be made to stick. And it seems to me that a lot of the work goes on in legitimation, and back to this case and to the case of early modern grain rioters, which is in my mind for some reason. John Walter's work on that shows that profiteering merchants invoked their market rights as against the poor's rights to subsistence, and the poor appealed to the state successfully against landlords. It's a rereading or a version of E.P. Thompson's Moral Economy. It's not so much one version of economy juxtaposed with another, but two sources of legitimacy broadly recognised, and a contest over how they apply in this case. And I think that's probably true for other colonial settings. It's a long time since I knew anything at all about this, but nationalist movements, it seems to me, play the same kind of game. Okay, if what legitimates your authority is this set of values, these set of values point to you not doing this anymore, and extending me these rights and obligations and duties. And so it's back to the kind of point Steve has been making, that this makes it all look inevitably contested, that it's a process of legitimation. It's not a process of violence, except where legitimation has failed. And as you say, because it's had to resort to violence, it no longer looks like a legitimate state.
I'm finding this really, really helpful, but there are two things there are two things that I wanted to try and add. The first is where I go along with Mike, which is not so much to argue that the state is anywhere that it works, but saying the state is anything that works locally. That is to say that one of the things that we're talking about here is precisely the very varied local forms through which the state can gain legitimacy. And I think in the imperial setting, that, I mean, both locally within Britain or regionally within Britain, but certainly in the imperial setting, the state is a very hybrid, takes very hybrid forms because it has to adapt to the forms of authority that work locally. And I think that's a very important point to raise, even if David is right to counsel that, you know, the more heterogeneous state forms become, then the slipperier, the less effective it is as an analytical tool. And I think that's a difficulty that we all struggle with. The point where I probably want to diverge a little from what we're now calling the Braddock Thesis is the emphasis upon solely political power. And I think there's a strong early modern dimension to this discussion where basically the state having a monopoly of political power is the big question. And I think that certainly, if you think of Jordana's talk, the further that you get into the 19th and the 20th century, the far more varied the work of the state. And the state is acting in ways that are absolutely not political. That's the whole point. The state is about abstracting itself from the political domain and taking seemingly, abstract and scientific and bureaucratic procedural forms. So it's very hard for me to think how, for instance, an inspector checking air quality is somehow involved in a struggle for for political power. I mean, I think that you could make that argument, but it's important to recognise, for me, the importance of the economy and the social and even the cultural as critical areas of state action in the modern period.
I had a whole bunch of hands in blue-green. Yeah, that's you.
Nobody's actually mentioned Wales, which is understandable. But I'm just curious.
I did.
Yeah, actually, a mention of it in terms of its incompatibility with the legal system.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm kind of curious where Wales fits into this idea of state, because if you're Welsh, particularly like in the more modern period, I'm sorry, then the state looks like an English state. It's not a British state to them. It's an English state. So I just wonder how you can kind of, you can define and distinguish Ireland and Scotland, but nowhere Wales isn't even represented on the flag, for goodness sake.
I think, Wales was integrated into the English state much earlier than the Union of England and Scotland. I mean, it was the Acts of Union in the 1536 and 43, and it was totally anglicized, or at least from a political point of view. So I think that's probably, so it doesn't seem to enter into this whole discussion of England, Scotland, and Ireland, and then the empire.
Why not Steve and then Frederick? All right, Frederick and then Steve.
Coming back to James' point about expertise and whether it has politics, I'm terribly interested in this. I mean, it seems to me very significant, and it would be wonderful to pinpoint maybe a moment or a phase of transition when the state begins to say things like, we're not going to beat you over the head with this, but we know better than you. We have superior expertise. Whether that happens with the excise, with metrology, with political economy, or later still, we can debate. But it seems to me that, of course, there's politics and metrology and who gets to measure how much alcohol, what the alcohol percentage might be, as William Ashworth has shown lately in his work on the excise. And take another example, famine relief in India, right? How do we define what a famine is? Is it politically constituted? That's what Adam Smith says, right? Or is it to do with drought phenomena, with the monsoon cycle? That's what the natural historians of Richard Drayton's work would say, right? But what I'm really fascinated by is the means by which expertise may be capable of simultaneously occluding sovereignty and dispersing it. I'll leave it there and we can continue debating.
Steve?
It strikes me that both James's last point and David's point are raising issues of perspective. And it strikes me that there's two different ways of looking at this problem. And it strikes me that David's point is that the state looks like it's everywhere if you focus on people invoking the state. And I think that that's true. But if you think about the successful invocation of the state, then you have, and that is to say where the state actually acts upon these invocations, then things look differently. And it strikes me that this is also, the issue that Mark's pointing to. There's another question that Mark's pointing to, which is which state is it that they're invoking, which is a separate question. Wish we had a panel on that. And it strikes me that James's point about the ostensible neutrality of somebody checking air quality depends on from what perspective that is. That is to say, if you're a big polluter and you're having somebody checking your air quality, that's a political question for you. Whereas the action of the guy checking, or the woman checking the air quality, is an ostensibly politically neutral thing. They're given a set of directions, they're acting upon expert knowledge, and they don't see themselves at all as a political actor. So it strikes me that, and it strikes me that this has absolutely nothing to do with whether you're talking about the early modern or the modern period. That it strikes me that this is, this is a point which we'll come back to. But it does strike me that what one needs to be very careful about, and it strikes me that this is the value of Mike's successful invocation language as opposed to invocation language, is that one needs to focus very carefully on what perspective. If we're looking about people who appeal to the state to act on their behalf, then the state is everywhere. But if you look at the way, whether or not their appeals are successful or not, then it strikes me that you get into this area of contestation. And it strikes me that that's exactly what Brian was pointing to. It strikes me that that's one way of reading your comments, is that the question of whether or not there was a British state with respect to Scotland is precisely about whether people are able to appeal to the British state to act on Scottish-specific issues, or whether, in fact, what you get is an imposition from London or for someplace else of a different kind of agenda. So it strikes me that what you need to be thinking about is the perspective is the central question.
Frederick's question about expertise. So I think this is really interesting, and there's a real opportunity there for historians of Britain to make an intervention in a field that's been dominated, I think, by Americanists, and the discourse of the politics of expertise in social science for the U.S. has really been shaped by this binary of collusion or resistance, right? That the experts are either good guys or bad, they're heroes or villains, right? They either colluded with the state and furthered the state's aims in all kinds of nefarious ways, mostly to do with the Cold War, but sometimes to do with American imperialism, or they very occasionally were the heroes who stood up and said, no, this is not a good idea. But I think there's a real opportunity for scholars of Britain to intervene in that framework and to think about expertise as a competing center of authority with the state. So one of our questions for this panel was to do with whether, find what the exact wording was, but decentralized. Why focus on the state? And if we need to ask where it is our attachment to it an artifact of the foundational concerns of political theory and history as disciplines, failing to take into account the decentralized nature of power and the multiple forms of its operation, which I thought was really interesting because it seems to me that the story of the state is completely compatible with thinking about the decentralized nature of power, and that focusing on expertise, as you suggested, is really one way to do that, that rather of thinking about whether the state kind of adopted wholesale the knowledge of experts, one might think more about the decentralization of authority, and I'm here really only speaking for the 20th century, and the breakup of authority in which you see experts in the states kind of vying, again, for the control not only of politics, but of the sphere of the social, the economy, et cetera. So I think that's a very useful question.
Callum has hand up before.
Can I return to the question of air pollution inspection? 1787, the Town Council of Glasgow appointed a committee to look into the pollution of the air in central Glasgow caused by smoke from the steam engines which were starting to propel the new cotton mills in the city centre all along the Brumelawn. Letters had been sent to the town clerk from the rich and famous of the city, including the local sheriff and merchants. It was very interesting that merchants who were not involved in the trade were objecting, and that they were having to leave the city to their summer residencies 5-6 miles out of the city because they were getting ill. And it looked for a moment as if the town council might actually suppress the budding Industrial Revolution. But it disappeared. There's no account for what actually happened in this committee, but no restrictions came into being. Now, my point here is that this is not a British state. This is not even a Scottish state. This is a local state, which is broaching a new area, which was to become of interest to the state, which reflects on the early origins of the Victorian Revolution government, which was very much, in many cases, the adoption of good ideas at local level. The local states had, we must do something about this. In some cases, it was a case of local authorities not doing something about this, and private citizens bringing private acts into Parliament. Bear in mind that a large proportion of the acts of Parliament, I can't speak about now, but certainly in the Victorian period, were private acts, were not public acts. But many of those private acts became government acts. I presume the same can be done for England, but for instance, Scotland got Sunday closing of public houses in 1853 after Glasgow had done it 4 years before. It's following a model of a particular local state. And then that raises the other issues about who's proposing these acts of Parliament. Is it the state, or is it a particular interest group, in this case the temperance movement, churches, certain parts of the churches? The state, there is no single state necessarily behind all these actions. The state is a conglomeration, a working out of conflicting powers. Sometimes the conflicts result in acts being passed, being repealed, being amended. There is no single driving elephant of a state here. It is a constantly amorphous, changing, working out So I'm every time I hear somebody saying the state, or even the British state, or even the Scottish state, I'm thinking, it's not one single thing.
We have a heretic. Let me get, Maura has been trying to get in for a while in the back, and then maybe Mike wanted to respond.
I don't know that I need that. I found this.
No, yeah, bring it, it's unfortunately.
I just wanted to return to a few points as a kind of a late modernist, and that is to say that I think Jordana and James are right and insightful about a couple of things. One is sources, I think, are incredibly important. And what I really loved about what Jordana said is that methodologically, it's very interesting for her to think about looking for the state or manifestations of state power in as boring a question as decolonization is, which historiographically it is pretty boring. So is the social welfare state literature fairly boring. And I think to think that those should be combined is not only sort of brilliant, but it also gets to the other point that James reminded me of that I wanted to raise, which is, I was trained here to think about where the nation lies more than where the state lies, and that's about power, and that's manifested in ideas about legitimacy. And so it has to be. So my question to the panel and in the audience was a bit about legitimacy. Where does legitimacy lie? It has to be different in the 1950s when the polity, I remind us, representation was manifested very differently than it could have possibly been in 1688 or 1720 or 1780 or 1870 even. So is that the question of, dare I say, democracy or liberalization? I mean, is that not also a question about that would make sort of the way that Jordana comes to this problem very different than the way that even David comes to the problem, that the way that a 16th century historian would about the state? So, so the question of legitimacy and representation was, I thought, sort of key and important for us to maybe contemplate. And my other related thing, which I guess we'll get to in other sessions, is the fact that some of us actually call the 19th century state an imperial state. and what do we think about that? So anyway.
Mike, did you want to?
I was going to respond to Callum and also to a couple of other points that have been made. It was exactly your problem that led me to formulate the Braddock model. The Elizabethan Poor Law follows exactly this pattern, that it's an innovation in urban centres subject to massive in-migration, the sharp end of structural economic change. But what enables boroughs to respond is powers delegated to them by central government, and those models are then taken up and form the basis for national legislation in exactly the same way. Now, it doesn't seem to me, since we agree on the phenomenon anyway, it doesn't seem to me that describing that as the work of a state gets in the way, particularly. But it does raise two other points. The air quality point. This is not my distinction. It's a distinction Michael Mann quotes from someone else. We've been talking about power, and I've been talking about power in Mann's terms as a distributive issue, my power over you. But there's also a collective power, which is our power together. And it's clear that political power, the invocation of state power, can enable collaborations and collective exercises of agency, which are and deliver public goods. And air quality might be one of those. But in the real world, one person's air quality legislation is another person's restriction on free manufacture and free trade, so that there's always, these things are intertwined. But I wouldn't want to, I have been speaking as if I think the state is only ever exercising, state power is only ever used by A over B. It's clear that in the 16th century, the air quality equivalent was bridge maintenance, highway maintenance, infrastructure, what we would now call infrastructural maintenance, which is a public good delivered collectively using state power. But once you start talking about this collective collaboration, the delivery of public goods by the state, I think that's where the porousness is most difficult to deal with, because so much of this is actually achieved by what we would want to call civil society organisations. And here I'd point you to Phil Withington's recent work on associational life. problematic in Professor Pincus's view, but he's raising. In fact, I had just to give you a glimpse of metropolitan life in Sheffield. I was drinking cappuccino in a garden centre with Phil Withington only last Sunday, where we discussed exactly this issue, that my version of the state kind of absorbs a lot of what you might want to talk about in a civil society conference, actually, and it gets back to the point you made 20 minutes ago, that if you abstract the state, as we've been asked to, you then have to reinsert it. What is the state operating in relation to? I mean, just as if you want to write a history of England, you abstract England, but then you acknowledge that England's fate is intertwined with all sorts of other things, but you're writing a history of England. So I set out to write a history of the state. I set up the state in this kind of way, and much of that book is actually about how the state then becomes implicated in all these other sets of social and economic and cultural exchanges.
I had a like-minded reaction to Colin, which it seemed to me, for all the importance and the real importance about this reminder about how local much of what we're attributing to the state is the initiative, is the action, is the decision maker, it still seems to me that the mechanisms by which a local elite or a particular group prevails is not a product entirely of the locality. And that was in your own example. I mean, there's a difference between whether you're getting a private act of parliament as opposed to a royal patent, as opposed to a writ out of chancery. I mean, the same things that one might want to do in a local area at various points in time change. I mean, to get the warrant to do it, to get the authority to do it. And that doesn't seem to me simply up to local choice or up to local initiative. And that's part of, the right concentration on state beyond the locality.
Krista and then Barbara.
I wanted to ask about the licensees, the patentees, these sorts of folks, which we see very much of in the 16th and early 17th century, and again quite recently. Where do they fit into this? I mean, all this talk of differences between center and local, or the private distribution of public goods and these public collective goods. So where do these licensees and patentees fit into this? This picture that we've all been talking about, not to complicate it further, but, and again, this kind of comes back to some of the original questions about sources. Of course, it's the 16th century. We have the creation of state papers, and very often the actions of these licensees and patentees are hidden from these state papers because they are the actions of essentially private individuals, but in some way acting on behalf of a state. I mean, how do we conceptualize their role in all the things we've been talking about? Any ideas from the panel?
The state about the production or the reception of something. Is that? I mean, yeah, it's a good point. I mean, it's. If the state, as you've defined, we are all defining it, is about the invocation of that authority, the successful invocation of that authority, it's not clear then, I mean, if mere private action then becomes implicated in the state, I think we are quickly going to lose any sort of specificity that the state might have and sort of send it willy-nilly down the road any place anyone is invoking authority. Let me get Barbara first.
I wonder if another way to approach this would be to ask if there are any institutions that the state must have. That is, can you have a state without lawmaking authority? Can you have a state without a system of courts or institutions to administer the law? If you don't have those, does the state have to not exist in there? And I think possibly we might look at certain kinds of institutions that this thing that we're talking about has to have or doesn't have to have. And one of those would be, I think, lawmaking authority, a system of courts or court-like bodies, possibly a bureaucracy of sorts, large or small. Another thing that we might say it has to have is military force, armies, navies, and so on. I wonder if we went about it sort of from that point of view, whether we could get a better idea of what we mean by a state.
I think that you've raised a really interesting question here, because I think we have lost sight of what is generally considered to be one of the main characteristics of the state, and that is its sovereignty. And of course, that sovereignty is expressed in law. And I think that one of the problems talking about a local state, as Kalman suggested, or talking about, let's say, the East India Company as a company state, is that those entities do not have sovereignty and they don't have lawmaking ability. And Steve is. But also, I mean, it comes back to this whole question of the successful invocation of state authority. I think that we have to talk about what that authority is that is being invoked, and I think we have to say that it is sovereign power that's being invoked. And if it's not sovereign power, then it's not the power of the state that's being invoked. So it comes back to that whole question about Scotland. In other words, are they invoking the power of the sovereign? Habeas corpus would be a good example. But if they're invoking another aspect of this network of political power, then that's not really state. I mean, I think we're in danger of losing a definition of the state here unless we can at least talk about the type of reservoir of political and legal authority that is the state. Yeah. No.
Can I make that even worse?
Can you do it in the mic?
Yeah. I'm getting comfortable with this. It's a wonderful thing to hold. We should also remark that there's a great irony in us having this conversation in one of the world's great failed states, that is California. No, I wanted to make a serious point here. It's sort of interesting to me that almost all of our discussion has been what I would describe as a vertical discussion of where the state is. That is the territorial question of the local, the national, and the imperial. And very little, until very recently, about what I would describe as a horizontal view of the state, i.e. the boundaries between the state and civil society. And in a sense, I mean, I think that takes us back to the realm that Jordana was talking about earlier, because I wanted to raise the issue of the transition from the voluntary sector to the state sector and whether it makes any difference. So, of course, a great example here would be the whole arena of infant welfare. You know, so you have there's a whole range of busybody people, mainly bourgeois women, advising working class women on how they should structure sleeping arrangements in their hovels, how they should feed their children, how they should bathe them. I mean, absolutely every minute detail of how it is that you raise children. And that's happening pretty early. That's happening, in the 1830s and the 1840s. It's not until almost a century later that those forms of authority become structured into state forms. So for me, that issue of power and how it works seems, in a sense, immaterial to the actual state itself. Seems to me that power is operating in almost exactly the same way. It's just that when it becomes enshrined within the state, it becomes officially legitimate. So I think that question of the horizontal structuring of power is an absolutely critical one. And where it is that you draw the line is a much harder thing to do than how it is that you draw circles around the territorial boundaries of the state.
I mean, I think, that returns to the original point that you shouldn't, I don't think, define the state in terms of function, because it takes functions and sheds functions and takes them over from civil society or not. The question is whether you can tell who's doing it, and it seems to me your case is relatively clear on that point, that it's done by civil society actors and then the state takes it on. It returns again to David's question and this very difficult one about the relationship between state and civil society. And there it seems to me you have to be able to identify people as state actors as opposed to civil society actors. And in the early modern case, I plumped for office, someone's authority depending on territory, jurisdiction, functional specificity, underpinned by the use of legitimately sanctioned violence. And that's an office, and if the person doing it is an office holder, then that's the state, and it's not civil society. There is this very problematic area then of licensees and patentees who in some sense hold a kind of office, but are not really one widely regarded as legitimate. And just while I've got the floor, to return to the question of legitimation, it's undoubtedly the case that legitimation works differently in 1950 from 1650. Media and all sorts of other things. But one other distinction pointing in the other direction is that office holders in early modern England had to sustain their legitimacy in relation to all kinds of other social relationships. In a modern DSS office, people are protected by plexiglass and are neutral agents of rules that have been legitimated by democratic election, and then it's rolled out. That's a different kind of legitimacy, and it's not regarded as very legitimate in many benefit offices up and down the country. The position of an early modern office holder was rather more complex. They didn't have a democratic sanction, but they had to constantly maintain recognition of their right to act locally, and that is an area where all sorts of interests became implicated in how state authority worked, but it also restrained the exercise of naked interest, because I couldn't just act as a middle-aged rich man, otherwise I would lose my legitimacy. So it also served to restrain the use of my office, which in my world is a restraint on the actions of the state.
There's a few hands up, but let me jump in for just a second. Wonder whether there isn't even more sort of fuzzy area between the sort of state civil society, in the sense that, well, A, we have the problem of authorization. Those bourgeois women in the 1830s are not acting for the state, but they are surely in some sense authorized by a state that determines a relationship between wealth and power that puts them in an authoritative position over the women they're speaking to. There's also the problem of the rhetoric with which those women talk about child rearing, which I would, give, 3 to 1, is about the way British women raise their children, right? Is what they do in Bengal, I don't know, but this is how we do it in Britain. So there are any number of ways in which I would think, again, if we take this very porous version of the state, it can enter in through all these back doors that we may or may not want to accept. So I saw a hand in the back first. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering during our discussion, we focused a lot on, in a way, a positive definition of the state as, well, an entity to which you can successfully invoke, or that can successfully invoke authority on its territory. And I was just wondering if we shouldn't also pay, well, maybe a little bit more attention to, in a way, the negative definition of the state that seems to be prevalent in its self-image, in a way. So I'm just thinking of the imperial context here, for instance, like the partition of Africa after 1884, for instance, where in a way Africa was split up between all these different territories, and in reality, there was very little chance of invoking any authority for the next 20 or 30 years, but in the self-image of the state, the important thing was not that actually you were able to realize authority, but that no other state was actually able to realize authority on your own territory. So in a way, it's a claim, kind of staking your claim to the future of at one point being able to realize your own authority. And so I was kind of just wondering, how do we reconcile this kind of inherently binary nature of the state self-description of either being somewhere or not being somewhere, and no one else being allowed to be on your own territory, versus the, in a way, reality that we can see of a very kind of gradual and kind of unclear reality where the state is much more real in certain places than in others. And then also to what extent we could maybe compare this to the development of modern notions of property, for instance, where also in some ways the important thing is not anymore that you actually use your property, but the important thing, at least in the ideology, is kind of a negative definition that no one else is allowed to use your own property, whether you yourself use it or not.
Carrie, yeah. Can we pass that mic up again? Sorry.
I was going to bring up a similar example of East Africa prior to the Protectorate in the 1870s. You have the British military literally there to police the slave trade. The question becomes whether or not the fugitive slaves can invoke the right to protection that the British state, as on board a British military ship, can provide. The question then becomes, that is decidedly a state power, but without territory, can they actually exercise that power, and ought they to exercise this power? And it becomes a big debate. Can they do this according to the law of nations? Can they do this according to their own treaties? Ought they to do this? Ought they to invoke that state power, whether they have it or not? And therefore, if they invoke it, does that mean that they actually have to expand the empire to have a territorial state to deal with the consequences? So I think, at least in this example, and it's one particular example, but I think in moments like this, you can see how contested it is in multiple ways, that in this they're defining what state power can be or ought to be outside of Britain, and whether or not that brings or has to expand Britain elsewhere as well. So I think in moments like this, we can start to see changes and go from there.
Yeah, Will, and then Callum, and then Steve.
One problem, I think, with the invocation of the state producing the state is that states in the form of statutes, proclamations, and so on sometimes invoke their own authority to approve a huge variety of behaviors that happen all the time, every day, everywhere. The state claims that people should work and not be idle. It claims that people should be peaceable and not fight. And it claims that this is what citizens or subjects should do, and lo and behold, they do it all the time, everywhere. And if you accept the state's own version of its own authority, then that means that the state really is everywhere, because people, of course, in day-to-day conflicts aren't invoking the state all the time, but people are working and being peaceable and doing various other things that the state wants them to do all the time. So I mean, I think if we look sort of from a top-down perspective rather than a bottom-up perspective of what it means to invoke state authority, we get a definition of the state which is the Leviathan or something that's entirely too broad to deal with, because it dominates all aspects of life for everyone all the time.
Callum?
Thank you. Can I return to Mike's point, which I agree with? I come from the same kind of background about who's wielding the power, about power groups. But then, and I have every sympathy with that, and I will use that perspective. But then I would put a postmodern spin on it. I will bring in Foucault, and ask, well, is there not a discursive power going on? And whilst Foucault spends a lot of time, quite rightly, saying there are interest groups who exploit discourse, who and use it for their own purposes, indeed make their own professions and power groups. There's also the fundamental point about that discourse exists independent of power groups as well. And he talks about it, discourse is born in the anonymity of a murmur. It's not necessarily the case that it's created. And thus, just to link it with what Ethan was saying, I mean, the interesting case of British middle-class women of the 1830s don't have the vote, yet are we saying they're powerless? No, there are discourses about motherhood, about femininity, about respectability, which makes women very important in discourse. But does that necessarily empower them? Discourse is about them as much as generated by them. So the whole issue of power is very complex. And I would just finally give one example about the state. A significant area of the state, returning to private acts of parliament, is sorting out legal issues. Parliament, much of its time is operating as a court. And one example down to the 1850s was that in England, to get a divorce, you needed an act of parliament. I mean, is this the same as the Colonial Office, the Foreign Office? The state has a multiplicity of functions, with a multiplicity of discourses and power interest groups operating in it, I still have a problem about seeing the state as legitimating one single power. Sovereignty is not power in itself. Sovereignty is only legitimacy.
Steve.
Yeah, I actually, in a certain sense, want to come in in a certain sense, want to come in on exactly this point, if I can understand how this thing works, and both agree and disagree. It strikes me that Brian was right to invoke sovereignty as a central defining characteristic of the state, but not if it means absolute sovereignty, because I think absolute sovereignty never exists, and we always speak as if we're talking about absolute sovereignty. So, for example, to think about the 21st century world, the extent to which the United Nations can make claims on various things suggests that members of the United Nations, except when they can absolutely define them, have no absolute sovereignty. In the same ways in which, economists always talk about property rights as if they're absolute claims, but of course everybody knows that states can tax, which means that any state that can tax means that there are no absolute property rights. And it strikes me that one needs to think about sovereignty as a much more porous category. And in this sense, I agree with what Callum was saying. But where I disagree is that I don't think, and this is sort of my anti-Foucauldian perspective, is that I think one needs to think about institutions being central to the constitution of power. So it's not just the discourse, it's the discourse and the way in which it acts and interacts with institutions, but institutions need not be central institutions. Institutions can act at a variety of different levels. So I don't believe that there is such a thing as discursive power. I think there is power which is implemented at some level in institutions, and what it needs to do is use much more sophisticated. And here, when I think the sort of new institutionalism, and a lot of work in the new institutionalism in the social sciences has taken a sort of post-structuralist perspective and moved beyond it in very interesting ways. And that's why I think we need to read a lot more in the harder social sciences than we do. And I'll just sort of leave it at that.
That actually gets us right to where I wanted to go for the last bit, which is back to these central institutions. Right? It's remarkable that we've now talked for an hour and 45 minutes about the British state, and we've had Barbara mentioned the monarchy. I think we've had a couple of mentions of Parliament. So at a certain level, right, if we'd been having this conversation 25 or 30 years ago, the entire conversation would have been dominated by discussions of the institutional histories of those two institutions and their sort of tentacles through the law, through the Lord's Lieutenant, through the justices of peace, and so forth. Should we bring those back seriously into the discussion of talking about the British state? What are we doing talking about the British state in a way that doesn't put the King in Parliament at the center of the discussion?
King in Parliament exercises sovereign power. I think when we talk about sovereignty, whether it's divided or whether it's porous or whether it's, we're talking about Hobbes, we're talking about Leviathan, and we're talking about an abstract concept. And certain officials, certain bodies, whether it can be a monarchy, a parliament, carry that sovereignty. That's all it is. It's a legitimating authority, and it's the source of their right to make law and also to tax. And it seems that Parliament has to be brought into it, because when people are appealing to a central reservoir of authority, they are appealing to, well, certainly after 1689 or after 1707, they're appealing to the sovereign power of Parliament. And I just think that if we start talking about in Scotland in the 18th century, it's a satellite state or a company state or a local state, we lose sight of the fact that sovereignty is exercised in those central institutions, and they are appealed to. Now, it's true that power is exercised through a variety of offices, such as you referred to, the network of offices. But you have to come back to the center, it seems, if you're talking about appealing to a legitimating authority. That's the way I would look at it. No, Steve is
a disembodied hand way in the back.
So one way to kind of bring the institutions, I don't know why I'm standing, is this awkward? Sorry. One way to kind of tell the old story in a new way bring in Parliament or the institutions is to think of the state not as kind of a monolith which invokes its own authority or produces discourses which are then consumed, but the state, it's kind of a dynamic process of negotiation, right? So I think a lot of our problems with the Braddock Thesis is that it's too...
Hour old.
Well, I think it's good, but I think in some ways it's too one-sided, right? That the state doesn't just invoke itself, and there it is, but it has to be recognized, right? This is a word that's important to Charles Taylor, right? So, for instance, two examples. We can send a guy to the moon, and he can plant a flag on the moon, but that doesn't make it the 51st state, right? I mean, the act has to be recognized by an other, right? By an audience, and so. I mean, one of the ways we can think about the state and its institutions is how do they gain that recognition, and then how is that recognition legitimized? And of course, Parliament then would be a big part of that story in the British context. But it's also, I think, it's not also about sovereignty, but also about usefulness or efficacy, right? So the state might be recognized because it gets things done, right? If you want to send a letter, you go to the post office, right? And that's the state. So it's another way of thinking about,
Daniel.
Well, I mean, I'm sort of sympathetic to what I'm very sympathetic actually to what to the Braddock thesis, but also, I mean, there's a kind of an artificial exercise, right? And essentially, we sort of we're here to talk about the state, so we're sort of, and I think, and I think when you look at the state, okay, and we look at institutions and you look at apparatuses, I think it's, the question is what institutions, right, you look at, and that goes back to also to James's kind of question, right, about the kind of horizontal, if you like, location of the state. I mean, just, from what I work on the 20th century, I'm just thinking of, David Edgerton's recent book. So suddenly the state looks very different if you look at institutions like research and development in science, if you look at places like the Ministry of Aircraft Production and so forth. On the other hand, and here I agree with Steve, but sort of disagree on it. I mean, I don't think Foucault was, only his. I don't think he was only interested in discourses. I mean, it's practically, but the question is which institutions you look at. I mean, that would be the questions that he would. And that's where also, when you start looking at these institutions, that's where the distinction between state and civil society becomes very, very blurry. Again, if you think about Britain during the Second World War and the various, the various attempts to secure industrial peace, where suddenly the unions and the British Employers Federation and the Federation of British Industry and all these people, sort of come into some kind of what, Keith Middlemass called essentially a corporatist state. So is the state just another actor among the three, or are all these bodies suddenly, can we see them actually as part of this porous, if you like, boundaries of the state that we're talking about? I mean, that is sort of the...
We're now into the later Braddock, right? So we approach 2 hours in the life of this thesis, but I think the problem I was trying to address in my work was the one you're posing, that people come up with quite different explanations for what drives state development according to which institutions they look at. And so rather than choose my institutions, I tried to think what constitutes an institution exercising political power. And then looking at that, I came up with a much more multivalent view of what the state was up to, whose interests it was serving, with what effect, to what extent it was a collective good, delivering public goods, to what extent it was delivering on the interests of particular groups. And that leads you into this problem of the what James calls the horizontal boundaries of the state, the civil society state, and people disagree with me about where I've drawn them and so forth. On this larger question about institutional form, though, I think if you take my view that the state is this network of agents exercising political authority within a territorially defined unit and with whatever functional and institutional expressions you want, you can write the history of the state by saying that its institutional forms and its functions change and the languages with which state power is legitimated change. And so you have a very broad definition of the state, but many varieties of forms of state in historically observed situations. I mean, it seems that in some sense, some people here are suggesting that's too enabling or too broad to have any meaning. And what we ought to say is that a particular set of institutions, functions, and legitimation represents the state, and these other things are other forms of political life. Now, to me, I'm not sure why that matters. I mean, if you want to tell me that only the institutions and functions and languages in the British state in 1870 constitute a state, and I've got to call the Tudor-Stuart state a banana, okay, it's a banana then, but it doesn't really change what I'm actually talking about. That seems to be a relatively nominal question. That analytically, we're playing the same game. And to restrict our view of what the state is to a particular set of institutional, discursive, functional expressions of political power seems, well, okay, you can do it, but I don't know quite why you would want to.
I think we should let the Braddock Thesis have the last word. I'm delighted and surprised to say that worked, and bodes well for the rest of the day. Let me announce that it's now lunchtime. Those of you who have these little badges should have had little purple lunch tickets, and I believe that there's a lunch buffet out somewhere that we can use, although I don't really know any better than you. And then we have breakout sessions starting at 1 o'clock, so we have a good hour and a half before anyone has to be anyplace again. Thank you to our panelists for the first round of the day.